Well, welcome everyone to the 448th meeting of the New York Comics and Picture Story Symposium. This is a weekly reading series about comics with people who make comics, think about comics, work with comics in some way. It was founded a bit over a decade ago by the cartoonist and educator Ben Catcher, and we are so excited for tonight's guest, a friend of the, more than a friend of the symposium, Bill Kartalopoulos, who for the past few seasons has helped us with curation, curated a bunch of great events, and has always been a central figure in what the symposium does. He is taking a much-deserved hiatus this season from booking the symposium, but we still have him here. We're still honored to have him, and he's going to be talking to us tonight about the intersection between comics and lettrism. Now, if you know anything about Bill's work in comics, any of his scholarship, and any of his teaching and writing that he does. Bill is someone who is very knowledgeable and has a great care and appreciation for comics of all kinds and comics history in general. But he also does a lot of work, and he's done talks for the symposium about these subjects in the past of finding avant-garde movements throughout art history that either explicitly reference comics in a way that Bill feels should be articulated and brought into the fold for reasons I'm not going to speak for him. But I think one of the great things he does is highlight these movements and show how someone outside of the hermetic world of comics might look at a certain art movement that has things in common with comics and be able to approach the medium in a way that they might not have been able to approach it otherwise without the examples that he brings in. And so I think the work he does along these lines is extremely valuable. He's going to be talking to us, as I said, about comics and lettrism. Bill has there is a current exhibit up at the Center for Book Arts. It'll end on May 2nd. But it is really, for New Yorkers in general, whether you have an interest in comics or not, it is such a great opportunity to see this exhibit. It has so much obscure, hardly seen, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, but hardly seen in this country at all, original art from the Lettrism movement. And it's beautifully curated. It's in a very all killer, no filler room of this work, and it's at the Center for Book Arts. What's the address again, Bill?
28 West 27th Street.
28 West 27th Street. Seek out the Center for Book Arts and make a trip there. Bill also curated a great film series at Anthology Film Archives that highlighted some key. He co-curated this. It highlighted some key Lettrist films, and so we're glad to have him. You know, we almost missed him. He's doing stuff for the Center of Book Arts and Anthology Film Archives, but the symposium is his home, and he's doing this presentation for the symposium. We have people watching online, and we have a bunch of great people here in the room that I encourage all of you guys, if you have a question in mind, even if this question is kind of confused in your mind, or maybe you're not exactly sure what your question means, don't hesitate to ask that question. The symposium is rough around the edges. We want all kinds of questions asked, even if you haven't really explained your question to yourself. Comments, if you have an unformed comment, maybe consider not sharing that one or turn it into a question of some sort. But
What do you think of my comment?
well, that's good. I think that's a good solve. So we'll cross the bridge of comments when we come to them. But without further ado, and I should say, we really, one of the ideas of the symposium is a unity between audience and speaker. So we really do want you to engage with Bill, and he wants you to as well, I imagine. So without further ado, here is Bill Kartalopoulos.
Thank you. Thank you, Austin, for that really nice introduction. I really appreciate it. So yeah, let's get started here. So let me share my screen. I am unmuted. I am recording, and I am now sharing my screen. Okay. Is everybody on Zoom now seeing a yellow rectangle? Is this looking good to you, Austin, from your computer?
The audio's clear, and they say yes. And I'm going to ask them if they're seeing the screen.
Oh, I see a lot of things popping up in the chat.
Just ignore. I'll have it.
Chat's blowing up. Okay, getting a lot of yeses.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, folks. We appreciate your interactivity. Wonderful. Let me just do that. That's great. Fantastic. Oops. Great. Okay. So yeah, I really appreciate that introduction, Austin. Thank you. I really do. It was important to me to talk about comics and lettrism at the symposium for a few reasons. And not just to talk about it at the symposium, but I also did. We're doing a kind of rare, like hybrid, in person and online. Um, uh, Symposium, kind of harkening back to like the pre-COVID days when all of our sessions were in person, and at the New School. And I really wanted to do this talk connected to the exhibit at the Center for Book Arts at the New School and for the symposium for a couple of reasons. Because I think both the New School and the symposium have been really important to the fact that I've been able to do this work. I actually, I until recently taught at Parsons for many years. And while I was at Parsons, I got a master's degree in media studies. Using my faculty tuition benefit. Let's hear it for United Auto Workers. Okay. But anyway, one of the courses I took, and part of what I was trying to do was to use, that grad school program as an opportunity to further explore comics, or things that have links with comics. And one of the courses that I took was a course with Professor Mackenzie Wark, who we see here. I just saw her perform in Paris, and that's what that picture on the left is from. And on the right, we see her faculty profile page. But anyway, in the master's program in media studies at the time, Professor Wark was teaching a class on the Situationist International. So I took her class on the Situationists. Actually, just in preparation for this talk, I found all of my class files, including the syllabus. This is from the syllabus, and I noticed something at the end of the kind of introductory paragraph was this statement from Professor Wark saying, "Students are not obliged to follow my interpretation, and if anything, I encourage dissent from it. My larger goal in researching and teaching this movement is to seed new ideas and new practices out of it." And I think in this case, this certainly did seed a lot for me. So I want to acknowledge that because the Lettrists, as we'll, as we can discuss further, are most often referred to in connection to the Situationist International. Most often, Lettrism is kind of a footnote to the history of the Situationist International because Guy Debord was a Lettrist before he broke off, formed a dissident faction called the Lettrist International, and then after several years, changed its name to the Situationist International because we wouldn't be talking about the avant-garde if there wasn't, if there weren't like scissions and expulsions and lots of internecine warfare and things like that. Anyway, so I took this course really because of my pre-existing knowledge, which wasn't a lot about Situationist comics, which also existed, and we could talk about more. And I wanted to learn more about Situationist comics, but in the context of this course, I also learned about Lettrism. So actually, I even found my final paper from 2012, which I called Lettrism, Situationist Practice and Comics. Notes on a meeting between a developing historically commercial form and a revolutionary avant-garde. Which is the kind of title, thanks, which is the kind of title, it's the kind of title you come up with when you're, writing papers for your master's degree. Like notes on is the kind of thing you write when you're like not sure if you're actually making an argument. But we got through. Everything went fine, and I learned a lot. And in the process, I learned a lot about Lettrism and found that Lettrism also had really strong links with comics. And unlike the Situationists, there was actually a very large and diverse body of work that we could call Lettrist comics as well as Lettrist writing about comics. So anyway, since I took that course that finished as we see in May of 2012, I continued to gather information about Lettrism and comics. I also continued to gather information about the Situationists in comics. I also started finding other links between comics and various art and avant-garde movements. And then again, as we were sort of like crawling out of the COVID sphere, I did a presentation for the symposium. And I hadn't given a presentation after, even though I'd been, involved with the symposium in various ways as an attendee, a speaker, a moderator. I hadn't really given like a straight original presentation of new work almost since the beginning of the symposium. Like more than 10 years ago. And, during COVID, I really was thinking like I wanted to start pulling together some of this research that I've been doing that was just, I mean, it was just growing folders on my computer, insane spreadsheets and my Google Docs, et cetera. I'm sure many of you can relate. But anyway, so I wanted to pull it all together. So I decided to take the opportunity, I proposed doing a talk at the symposium in September of 2021 that I called Avant-Garde Histories of Comics 1945 to 1970. Because what I really wanted to do was sort of put everything together and just see what it looked like together and, what kind of links would suggest themselves. So this one covered, you can watch this online on the symposium's YouTube channel. This one covered a lot of ground. But it started out with the Lettrists, moved on to the Situationists. It included the work of Jess Collins, the Poema Processo group in Brazil, concrete poets, as well as, Joe Brainerd, who I've also done a lot of work relating to as well. So it was a lot of different things in one presentation, but I did spend a big chunk of time at the beginning talking about the Lettrists. So I did this talk at the symposium. And then it went online. And not very long after, I got an email from this person, Frederic Acquaviva. Great guy with a great name, Frederic Acquaviva. Frederic Acquaviva. It was funny to get an email from Frederic Acquaviva because to me he was just kind of this mysterious figure who I knew because I had seen the name many times in books about Lettrism. He has written books about Lettrism, some of them monographs, some of them exhibition catalogs. He's written texts about Lettrism and other books in the past. He did some small press publishing, reprinting Lettrist material. Frederic himself is principally an avant-garde composer, but has a deep interest in Lettrism. And so, anyway, he's someone who I was aware of as a scholar in the field, really, and one of the few who had done some significant and useful English language writing as well, even though he himself is French. He lives in England and writes well in English. So anyway, so his work had been very helpful to me. So it was great to hear from this person. And basically, he emailed me and he said, "Oh, I saw your talk. I saw what you said about the Lettrists. It was very good. You didn't make any mistakes." So that was, that really felt like a nice seal of approval. Anyway, and I was very happy to be in touch with this person who knows a lot more than me about this subject. Anyway, we stayed in touch. We got together a few times in France. And eventually Frederic, suggested that perhaps we could work together on an exhibit of material from his archive because he has a very thorough archive of Lettrist materials. Certainly, a lot of published material as well as some original artwork. So anyway, after a while, some conversation, we got in touch, I think initially in 2021. Eventually, this led to an exhibit that's up right now at the Center for Book Arts, Rewriting the World, Isidore Isou and the Lettrist Book. So the general concept, was, to do something for the Center for Book Arts that would really focus on the Lettrist book, which means various things. It means works of theory, it means artists' books, it means one-of-a-kind book objects. It means books that were published like mass market editions, as well as, Lettrist works that resemble graphic novels. So anyway, this is all up at the Center for Book Arts right now. There's a very rich variety of material. Most of it is from Frederic's archive. A few things are from me, and a few things are from the Thomas J. Watson Library at the Metropolitan Museum. So we've got that show up through May 2nd. There's a catalog that for the time being, for this moment, is probably the best general resource about Lettrism in English for the lack of much competition, but we did try to make it a good entry point, so we collected together a group of essays that we thought worked well together beyond the exhibition documentation. And then, as Austin said, when the show opened, Frederic and I co-curated a series of film screenings of an anthology film archive, because even though the exhibit focuses on the book, and today I'm going to be focusing even more on Lettrist comics, Lettrism was a multimedia movement. And they made film, they made books, they made artwork, they made paintings, they made sculpture, they did performances. It's a poetry movement. It's a like a lot of avant-garde movements. It's a multimedia movement, so we wanted to indicate that. So, okay, so that's probably the longest intro of myself, of my own presentation that I would normally do, but there was so much history with the New School and the symposium that led to my being here that I wanted to acknowledge that. So let's get then into this material, kind of tracing what we need to know about the history of Lettrism to understand how and why it connects with comics in interesting ways. In some ways, this is going to be like a kind of expanded accordion version of what I was able to do in that first talk a few years ago. But basically, we're talking about Lettrism. We're talking about an avant-garde movement, and we know that there were many avant-garde movements in the 20th century, going back to the, early turn of the 20th century. You've got all these modernist movements, Cubism, Futurism, etc. You get Surrealism, you get Dada, you have, these kind of like more niche movements like pataphysics and so on. You can understand Lettrism as fitting into this history. In particular, it's a post-World War II avant-garde movement, and therefore really at the tail end of the history of avant-garde movements. And Lettrism was founded by a Romanian immigrant named Isidore Isou. Isidore Isou had a kind of unusual early life. His father kind of homeschooled him in a highly accelerated and intense way. But anyway, what's significant to note is that Isou, during World War II, narrowly escaped an anti-Semitic pogrom in Romania, where he was from. And at the end of the war, he left Romania and went to Paris. And he went to Paris with the very specific intention of starting an avant-garde movement called Lettrism. Okay. And he, even though, like many avant-gardists, Isou would deny the influence of those who preceded him. It seems clear, that he himself was in a way inspired by the model of Tristan Tzara, who himself was, a Romanian Jew who went to France and started an avant-garde movement. So anyway, but he goes to Paris after World War II, and very quickly he makes a name. 2 years later, he publishes two books through Gallimard, which is, really like the most prestigious publisher that he could be published with. The one is, the kind of the aggregation of a name and a Messiah, which is a sort of auto fiction about his life, which alludes as well to his messianic tendencies. But the other is called Introduction to a New Poetry and a New Music. And this really is where he begins to introduce the key ideas of Lettrism. And I think the easiest way to understand Lettrism, in terms of like what it's about, and also like why is it even called Lettrism, is to sort of address one key idea that kind of helps, I think, explain Isou's project. Basically, Isou theorized that all art forms are constantly moving through two alternating cycles, what he called an amplic phase and a chiseling phase. Okay, an amplic phase and a chiseling phase. And his theory is that when an art form, or really any human endeavor, is in an amplic phase, it's bringing into itself as much as it can. But then it gets to a certain point where it's very full and it needs to go into a chiseling phase where it's deconstructed. And he said this is something that we just need to always be advancing in all of our art forms and in all of our human endeavors. So he argued, for example, that poetry had reached, and before I say anything, let me just add, this is really what you want from the avant-garde, overthinking in the form of modernist diagrams. I mean, that's the good stuff.
does the process start to repeat within one art form? Does it go back to an amplic phase after the chiseling phase is?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a cycle that's constantly continuing. So here, for example, this is from his book where he articulates this idea. He's arguing that poetry, for example, reached its full amplic phase with the work of Victor Hugo, and then you get Baudelaire who starts chiseling it. So it gets chiseled to the level of the image, to the word. And basically, his argument is that, Dada had chiseled poetry, as part of this continuous process over time, beginning with Baudelaire down to the present at the time. He says, Baudelaire introduced this chiseling phase, and it continued all the way through Dada, which chiseled poetry to the level of the syllable. Therefore, it is now up to us, the lettrists, to take the last step to chisel poetry down to the level of the letter, so that having thus chiseled it as far as you can go down to its last atom, you can inaugurate the next amplic phase for poetry. Okay. So basically, Lettrism started out as a poetry movement. And around Paris, Lettrists first really gained notice for their poetic performances. Isou quickly gained adherents, including Maurice Lemaitre, who was a very close, lifelong follower of Isou and proponent of the Lettrist movement, and Gabriel Pomerand, who was referred to as the Archangel of Lettrism, and who is kind of credited with co-founding the movement and getting it off the ground with Isou. Pomerand, in particular, himself performed Lettrist poetry around Paris, including, in particular, at the Le Tabou, the kind of famous post-war Parisian nightclub where, Boris Vian would play jazz music, and like, Sartre and the existentialists would be in like a table in the corner, and so on. And Pomerand would perform his poetry there. This is a quote from Boris Vian, who says, Pomerand was one of the surprising elements of the taboo during the time of those beautiful evenings. He had a very personal manner of declaiming his lettrist works in the face of the world, and one would wonder at each instant where his voice came from, and if there was enough left for the next word. The word? But is it a word? Is there such a thing as a lettrist word? Okay, uh, so this kind of oral performance of lettrist poetry is what the lettrists first became known for, and you can see an example of it in this short film by Orson Welles. This is from a series of films called Around the World with Orson Welles, where in each film he would go to some different place. It was almost like a travelogue. And he did one about Paris and the neighborhood of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. And so there's a clip of about a few minutes where he's interacting with the lettrist. So this will give you a chance to see Pomerand performing lettrist poetry, if I can get this video to play. Ta-da! Give it a minute.
Yan likidan bar, likidin ding, yang gosong ya, yang gosong yin, yang gosong yin. Hakujan bang gal, hakujan gal gal, hakujan bang gal. Yan. Hakujan bang gal, hakujan bang gal, hakujan bang gal. Yeah.
Now, I wish you would explain this, if you would, please, about these new sounds. You found some quite new letters, as you call these sounds.
That's right. Yes. We
Such as, for example, letters.
you have oh, things like or well, but you use this letters mixed with letters like A, O, B, C.
And you have some like one.
And you have well that one.
Yeah.
Well, I have one like this.
That's a complete letter.
Yeah, it's a mixture of letters and rhythm and different of strength in the way of saying.
In a few words.
Well, see, my friend and I were looking for new poetry, let's say new style in poetry. We studied the history of poetry. We were sort of disappointed by surrealist poetry, and then we invented this sort of new poetry using only the letters, writing symphonies or poems, what we call letters. Just with these letters.
Just with the letters.
That's right.
Let's have another little fragment. Nesh.
Yes,
Talk
Nesh.
about the spell.
Okay.
Nee. Nee, nakapata. Hey, tagahati. Gok lach,
Jadi betul ini laga orang tapi kita tanpa kerja kuda dan cari.
Okay, that's a very funny little clip. Okay, so you get kind of a sense of like the initial impression the Lettrists made doing these almost like aggressively sort of unintelligible poetry around Paris. Okay, now Lettrism, as I kind of alluded to before, like every avant-garde movement, was not just limited to one art form, but really wanted to transform all of society and like transform all areas of human endeavor. So after Isou, kind of renewed poetry by chiseling it down to the letter, as we've seen here, he then turned to the novel, okay, the novel. And in his book, Les Journaux des Dieux, which means you could say the newspapers of the gods or the diaries of the gods, he articulated his theory of what he initially called metagraphics, okay? And so Isou is looking at the novel after having dealt with poetry, and Isou basically says, the novel has not advanced since James Joyce. Everything since James Joyce has either been redundant or a step backwards, okay? So in order to, James Joyce has kind of done everything you can with text. Therefore, in order for the novel to move forward, the novel must become metagraphic. Okay, what does that mean? Metagraphic. Well, what Isou meant by metagraphics is that the novel, or even just writing, must be able to incorporate text and image and all possible signs, including things like Braille, musical notation, scientific formula, etc. And often what's called asemic writing that's non-intelligible, which in Lettrism often is kind of used as like a stand-in for all future codes not yet invented, basically. But that's the idea, that in order for writing to move forward, it must integrate all manner of signs. And he called that metagraphics. So in this book, Les Journaux des Dieux, God's Diaries, or the Diaries of the Gods, he has, there's a long text that explains all of these ideas, but then he demonstrated it with a 50-page metagraphic sequence that mixes text, images, and other codes. And first, for several pages, as we can see here, you've got a mixture of text and image with a blue plate. It's printed in blue ink. And then after many pages, a second layer comes in red ink. So suddenly you've not just got, all of these signs in combination, but you have two layers of signs in blue and red. And then finally, for the last several pages, a third yellow plate comes in. He called this, I think, geological metagraphic writing, because you have all of these geological layers of meaning, one on top of the other. We, just as a side note, we have this entire 50-page sequence installed at the beginning of the exhibit of the Center for Book Arts. It's not something that's really generally easy to see and spend a lot of time looking at. So that is one of the opportunities of the show that's up at the Center for Book Arts. Now, in this book, as I said, there's 50 pages of metagraphic plates, but there's even more pages of writing about metagraphics, about 100 pages of text by Isou. And he's writing about the combination of text and image and other codes. And perhaps not surprisingly, he starts writing about comics, okay, within the context of articulating his theory of metagraphics. And these are some quotes from Les Journaux des Dieux, where he talks about comics. Isou says, in the eyes of this essay, every comic was already the vulgar presentiment of a future metagraphic art. But this manifesto was needed so that this comics could know that they form an art. In the vulgar comics, it's about separate categories which perform addition without merging, without unifying in an original shape with the possibility of evolution. Here, for the first time, we raise this mixture, which becomes a form in itself, to the rank of an art or the arts. Who was interested until now, from the cultural point of view, in comics? And Isou, I will add, was also critical of comics readers, saying that in comics, the only interest is in the stupid adventure that they relate. The meaning of the story is enough, as if the form didn't exist, So he's saying the problem with comics fans is they're just satisfied, by the boring romance of Tarzan versus, thinking about the comics form. And he says, we raise for the first time this anonymous, vulgar, but terrible form to the rank of art, and we assimilate it to the prose of serious and thoughtful gentlemen. We introduce it into the novel and thus into the cultural order. Okay, so there's a lot in there that you could, pick apart and talk about. Nevertheless, it's pretty interesting in 1950 to see this avant-gardist writing so approvingly about the inherent possibility of comics. Now, granted, one thing that we do see is that the Lettrists sometimes are also very clear. On the one hand, they want to claim a kind of genealogy and say what we do is related to comics, but they also sometimes want to maintain that distinction. They say, well, comics are comics, what we do are metagraphics, In part, the way that they talked about it was to say it was kind of like the difference between like folk dancing and ballet, or something like that. The comics are kind of like the vulgar, everyday, folkish version, and then metagraphics are that, it's sort of elevated to art, to the level of arts, but nevertheless, I mean, what we'll see as I continue, and that's essentially what this talk is about, is how this is really just the beginning of a lot of engagement between comics and Lettrism, or between Lettrists and comics. Now, we've been talking about metagraphics up to this point. However, so he first articulates this theory in 1950, but around 1952 or 53, Isou renamed metagraphics as hypergraphics, because there was already a method of shorthand called metagraphics. So it gets a new name, hypergraphic. Okay, so now he's interested in hypergraphic writing, hypergraphic novels. Already a great concept, hypergraphic novels, Okay, so let's move on to, moving forward a little bit in time, actually about, into the 1960s. One of the things that we see in the 60s is a lot of engagement between the lettrist Maurice Lemaitre. He was the figure who we saw speaking English to Orson Welles in that video just a few minutes ago. Isou was standing in the middle, obviously doesn't speak English. He's just kind of standing there. Lemaitre, on the other hand, is more comfortable speaking English and is talking to Orson Welles in that video. So here we see him again as a young man trying to look very mature, of course, with his hat and pipe. Anyway, Lemaitre, especially in the 60s, shows a lot of engagement with comics. Even in 1950, his first hypergraphic work is a 10-page sequence called Kanai, which means Kanai, I think it means sort of like I'm not sure what the best, kind of like, it has a connotation in French, kind of like bums, or something like that. I'm not sure what the best precise translation of it is. But anyway, he did this 10-page sequence called Kanai. And what we see already here is that he's the first person to include specific comics elements. At the bottom of this page, we've got some collaged comics panels. And this is from 1950. But moving forward in the 60s, one of the things we see in French culture is that the 1960s is the period when a lot of like intellectuals start trying to kind of renovate comics in French culture. In much the same way that French film critics, had previously articulated the auteur theory, for example, and they formed these cine clubs, where they were watching movies and having debates. And there, obviously there are these magazines like Cahiers du Cinéma, etc. So, in a way, you've got the French who have kind of renovated American film, now sort of turning to comics as well. And in 1962, there's a group that's formed called Le Club des Bandes Dessinées. Again, it's the idea of the club. It's sort of like a reference to the cinema club, the Cine Club, right? So here it's the comics club, basically. So the club, and they have a newsletter called Gif Wif, which is a sound effect from I think from a Katzenjammer Kids comic. I'd have to check that to be sure. Anyway, so this is the club, the comics club, the Club des Bandes Dessinées, BD, BD, meaning comics in France. Some of the early people involved with this included, the writer and editor Francis Lacassagne and the filmmaker Alain Resnais, as well as Jean-Claude Fauré, who was the creator of Barbarella, Pierre Coupery, who was specifically a kind of a comics historian and worked on many books. So anyway, you've got, again, these kind of intellectuals getting together and arguing essentially for comics. And in the 7th issue of Gif Wif, the bulletin of the Club des Bandes Dessinées, one of the articles that we see, the one that's sort of highlighted there. What's that? Gif Wif? Bande dessinée is comic strip. That's okay. Comic strip. It literally means a strip that's been drawn. Dessin, dessiné. It's a band, like a band, so it's like a drawn strip. It's a band of drawings, basically. And in this issue from July 63, what we see is the compte rendu, the account of the first assembly general, this first general assembly of the comics club in France. Okay, and there's this interesting note where the translations are a little rough, they're mine, but anyway, where apparently what we learn is that Maurice Lemaitre, the lettrist, went to the first general assembly of the comics club, and what's reported here is that at some point during the proceedings, Monsieur Maurice Lemaitre criticized the president's conception of comics as imprecise, given that the future of comics must be conceived from the perspective of the dissolution of language. The president retorted that these interesting perspectives might be referred to a more specialized study group to be raised again at some future time after more immediate problems have been resolved. Interestingly, 4 years later, Lemaitre wrote, "One day, honest and well-informed historians will rediscover these traces of influence and say how, for example, Lacassagne and Resnais greeted with sarcasm Lemaitr's interventions at the first General Assembly of the Club des Bandes Dessinées." So I guess I am the future well-informed historian today, sharing this with you. Yeah, it's happening right now. Time is a flat circle. Okay, so anyway, but one of the things that's kind of interesting is like Maurice Lemaitre kind of has these occasional like skirmishes with the kind of emerging world of comics criticism in France, but often it sort of prompts him to make more comics. So not that long after this encounter in 1963 at the General Assembly in early 64, this is an issue of one of Lemaitre's Lettrist magazines, Lettrist reviews. Like any avant-garde movement, this was a movement that produced a lot of small press magazines. Okay, there's a lot of writing in these magazines, articles, graphics, etc. So this is one journal that was run by Lemaitre called La Lettre. And what we see here, so this is La Lettre, the letter number 13 from February 64. Earlier in 63, he had that encounter with the Comics Club. And what we see on the cover here is a drawing by Lemaitre. That's a comic. We can zoom in a little bit. And in fact, it's a very kind of conventional, almost cliche-looking comic, with like the Gothic handwriting and the sort of heavy narration and the fragmented, panels where the reading order is a little hard and so on. And obviously, you've got images of castles and people fighting with each other. It seems kind of like a heroic sort of comic. This comic is called Les Aventures de Heinrich Solo, The Adventures of Heinrich Sallow. Heinrich Sallow is indicated as sort of the main character in the story, The Adventures of Heinrich Sallow. Okay, so I'm going to just give you a translation of a few panels. So this is the way it starts. Summary of preceding chapters, as if this is an episode in a long-running serial. We get a summary. Summary of preceding chapters. The director of Magen Waben, Heinrich Sallow, continues his evil deeds, and El Momo, the valorous lettrist, decides to resume a campaign against the great enemy of the avant-garde. He arrives in front of the enemy's lair. Another exhibition about signs, said El Momo, but without the Lettrists. So this is dun 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 dun. Okay, so El Momo, that name comes up actually repeatedly. It's kind of an avatar for Maurice Lemaitre. So this comic is referring to real things. It's kind of a double attack. So it's called The Adventures of Heinrich Sallow, this curator in Magen Waben. Well, in fact, this is a reference to an actual curator named Dietrich Malo in Baden-Baden, who had curated a show called Schrift und Bild, meaning literally, writing and image. So obviously, and this was in 62, 63. So in 64, Lemaitre is criticizing this. This is the villain, right? Heinrich Sallow of Magen Waben is continuing his evil deeds by putting up another exhibition about signs, but without the Lettrist. Ba, 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 ba. Okay, so that's already, you've got one attack happening here, the kind of the malfeasance of this curator who excludes the Lettrists. And really, what we can say about this comic, too, is that I think it's really intended to be a critique of conventional comics. Because what it reminds me of is another quote from Isidore Isou's Les Journaux des Dieux, where he's also, continuing to criticize conventional comics. And he says, look at any comics magazine, always men's faces, and again, men's faces, and just below them, the text which tells the intrigue. Yes. Yes, that's true. Mhm. Yeah. Well, it's definitely more narrative. So it's kind of critiquing the sort of narration heavy style of typical adventure comics. But then he follows this, Maurice Lemaitre, he produces this in February 64. It's called Les Aventures de Heinrich Sallow, but it continues. It continues. But the next episode is completely different. So this is the name of the protagonist has flipped. In the first one, the bad example of comics, the protagonist is the villain, Heinrich Sallow, the evil curator. Here on the right, the hero is El Momo, meaning Maurice Lemaitre, LM, ML, El Momo, okay? Maurice Lemaitre, El Momo contre Heinrich Sallow. So El Momo versus Heinrich Sallow. Bande dessinée. So he's saying it is very specifically a comic. Episode 456, as if, this is like one page in a whole series. Now, suddenly, we see something very different here. This is, it's manifesting Lettrist aesthetics. You have these and this is a print. You've got these undulating bands of panels. You have this variety of different kinds of signs. You have this full integration of text and image. So in a way, it's like what we're seeing on the left is a comic, a conventional comic with a Lettrist subject, but what we're seeing on the right is a comic that has a Lettrist form. This is the Lettrist form of comics making. That's a conventional comic that happens to have Lettrism as a subject. So that's a kind of interesting thing there. And during this period, 63 to 66, we see a lot of engagement, like I say, or really 63 to 68 between Maurice Lemaitre and comics. He made in 1964 a series of self-portraits based on this photo of himself on the telephone that are kind of interesting. And this one here is the autoportrait à la BD, or self-portrait in the style of comics. And we see there's a page of comics hanging on the wall behind him, but his whole, the entire image is sort of made up of text and glyphs and other signifiers. This is a later touched up version. In 1964, this is from the Times Literary Supplement, the British newspaper. This is from one of two issues covering the new avant-gardes of the 1960s. So it's an issue on the avant-garde in 1964. It has a few Lettrist-related pieces on this spread. One is a text in English by Isou. Obviously, it's been translated from French. One is a review of Isou's works, which is a little mixed. But the other is this black and white image that you see sort of on the lower part of that page here. This is by Maurice Lemaitre, and it's subtitled, I don't know if you can read that caption, Lettrist and Hypergraphic Comic Strip, drawn especially for the Anglo-Saxon reader by Maurice Lemaitre. Okay, so it's a comic strip that has a form of the kind of a glyph. And what's interesting is when you read it all the way around, the title is actually on the left-hand side, about halfway down the image. It says Lettrist and Hypergraphic Comic Strip. So you would read down, over to the right, up, and then over to the left, probably having to rotate this thing around. And when you get to the end, it says, and this is phonetic French, Le anglais seront comme les autres inspirés de l'esthétique lettriste et hypergraphique, don't you think? So this means the English, like everyone else, will be inspired by lettrist and hypergraphic aesthetics, don't you think? Okay, and again, this is in the context of a lettrist comic strip. And just one last note I want to make about this engagement between Lemaitre and comics is, if we look at this as an example of lettrist comics by Lemaitre, these kinds of undulating bands divided up into what we might call panels, with different kinds of text and image and symbols in them. This became quite characteristic of his paintings in the 60s and moving forward, where we see regularly in his paintings the same kinds of undulating bands with different kinds of text and image and other signifiers there. Even this is a much later one from 1981, so I mean, it does kind of raise the question of, like, are his paintings also kind of comics, a kind of comics to him, if he's arguing that this is a lettrist form of comics implicitly or explicitly. Okay, so that's one thing we can look at, Maurice Lemaitre in the 60s, and we'll get back to Lemaitre and his ongoing skirmishes with the world of the Comics Club. But I want to talk about one other body of work within Lettrism in the 1960s. And this is going to involve another kind of conflict, a clash between the Lettrists and, I guess, a one-sided clash anyway, between the Lettrists and the popular French comics magazine Spirou, which is something that you can track in the pages of a Lettrist review called O. It's the letter O with a circumflex over it, as we see here. O was founded by a lettrist named Roberto Altman in 1965. Now, one of the things that's helpful to keep in mind here is kind of like other, one thing I'll say first is that, there are a lot of short-lived avant-garde movements that just lasted for a few years. Lettrism was surprisingly durable. I mean, there were people, coming into the movement, as late as like the 1980s, even though this is something that starts really around 1947. And in the 60s, you do get a second wave of lettrists who come in. Kind of like how you have, second futurism, for example, the second wave of futurist artists who have, their own kind of recognizable futurist aesthetics. Similarly, you have a group of artists coming into Lettrism in the 1960s. Among them, this person, Roberto Altman, not to be confused with Robert Altman, the director of Nashville, who's a wonderful director. Roberto Altman, however, is somebody else with a very interesting story of his own. His father was named Robert Altman, even more like Robert Altman. But Robert Altman was a wealthy art collector and publisher who left Germany in the 30s as the Nazis were coming to power and went to Cuba. And there in Cuba, he got married and had a son who he named Roberto, sort of the Cuban equivalent of Robert or Robert. So Roberto Altman is born in Cuba. Eventually, he leaves. He spends some time in Liechtenstein, a place he would maintain a connection to, but then goes to France. And in the 60s, he joins the Lettrist movement. He founds the review Oh. My co-curator pointed out that his father was Robert and he's Roberto. So maybe that is part of the meaning of the O for him. The O is the letter that distinguishes him from his father. Anyway, O was one of the most beautiful of the Lettrist journals. I mean, it's a kind of all-time great magazine with a wonderful variety of text image, and it has a lot of really strong graphics from this kind of second wave of Lettrists in the 60s. Among them, Altman's close collaborator, Jacques Spacagna. And in 4 of the early issues of O, we actually see a comics series by Jacques Spacagna called Epipopimal Epopée, which doesn't really mean anything. Epopée means epic, so it's an epipopimal epic. But what's important is that that word epipopimal has the word pop in the middle of it, because we're getting into the 60s, and among other discontents, the Lettrists really have a grudge against the pop artists who think that they're kind of a sort of very banal, who think are doing things that are kind of a very banal version of what the Lettrists have already done. So this is actually a comic strip series, a Lettrist comic strip series about a war between the Lettrists and the pop artists. Unfortunately, it only runs for 4 episodes, which is really too bad, because over the course of the 4 episodes, as you can see, they increase in size and complexity. And to me, these are just some of the most beautiful comics pages I've seen, period, in any context, with just this. They're black and white. I mean, the only color is that the magazine's, sort of brown from age. But anyway, these are all 4 episodes of Epipopimal Epopée that ran over the first, I think, 5 issues of the review O. But in the review O, we also see evidence of the next big conflict between the Lettrists and the world of French comics. And this occurs after the popular French comics magazine Spirou, which was popular among kids. It's where the Smurfs were published as Les Schtroumpfs originally. And in this issue, this was a weekly comics magazine for kids. On the cover, we see this kind of interesting sort of abstract image of abstract forms with this illegible writing across the front of the cover. And this is sort of a preview of a 1-page comic that appears inside that issue, which is drawn by the art director of the magazine, Maurice Rosy. So what we see are these kind of, semi-abstract forms and word balloons full of asemic writing. Okay. What's that? It's asemic, illegible writing. Okay. So, this was kind of drawn apparently as a lark by the art director. Later, it was included in a book of the greatest masterpieces of comics that was published by the magazine Planète. Anyway, this comic really, really really pissed off the Lettrists, and after it was published in Spirou in the review O in numero H, number H, I should note these. The issues are numbered using letters. So it's issues A, B, C, D, etc. This is issue number H. of the review, there's an article called the True Situation of Comics in Modern Art by Isidore Isou. At least that's what it says on the cover. The headline's a little different when you turn to the page. Death to comics! Hybrid, marginal, fragmentary, and stupefying. Long live hypergraphics, unifying all means of communication. Okay, so Izu is kind of really, I mean, he kind of conflates Spirou with the club of the comics club and basically says the Club des Bande Dessinées represents a despicable swindle, falsifying an after-the-fact defense against an earlier precise and limited defense of Lettrism, and is even so a plagiarism of greater advances achieved long ago by hypergraphics. So he really didn't like this comic. He thought it was a banalization of what the Lettrists had already accomplished. And as if to prove it, this issue includes several other interesting comics. Izou's article is illustrated by this one-row comic strip that is a collaboration between Roberto Altman and his partner at the time, the lettrist artist Maggie Moritz. So we see this really interesting one-page strip with these kind of semi-abstract figures. The word balloons, of course, are full of asemic writing. But this was not the only comic by Altman in this issue. After Izou's essay, several more such pages followed. And what's interesting is they're referred to as planches hypergraphiques, meaning hypergraphic planche. What is a planche? The word planche literally means a board of wood, but it's actually the word that's used to describe pages of original comics artwork. Kind of like how in English artists will refer to their work as being on boards, like I'm working on this board right now. It's similar to that. So again, it's interesting that they're really specifically tying this work to comics. So there are 4 pages like this in that issue of number Ash from 1966. But these pages by Roberto Altman were really just the beginning of a much bigger project, and that ended up being one of 2 major hypergraphic comics produced in 1968. He actually finished this work in 1967, but in early 68, Roberto Altman published about 421 copies of this book called Geste hypergraphique. It's more than 80 pages of comics like this. Geste hypergraphique means hypergraphic geste. What is a geste? A geste is actually, it's probably the closest translation would be either song or chant. A geste, it's actually a medieval term. It refers to a collection of long poems from the 11th to the 14th century in which, great deeds of historical or legendary figures were recounted. So this is geste hypergraphique. So it's hypergraphic geste, hypergraphic chant or hypergraphic cycle. There's a lot in here that's very interesting. There's this kind of abstract intimation of conflict. You also have these like abstract characters who themselves are confounded by the intrusion or invasion of occasional figurative elements or occasional letters that cause a lot of consternation and confusion. And in these images, we've got both, the title is a reference to a type of medieval song cycle. In the images, too, we have all of these kind of spear-carrying figures. They look like armies, and these resemble, too, some of the images we might see in painting and even in illuminated manuscripts from that period. So here, for example, this is from the Egerton Genesis picture book, the 14th century illuminated manuscript. This is from a work that's been discussed here at the symposium by Domingos Isabelino, the Cantigas de Santa Maria. And I should add, Domingos deserves a lot of credit for being the first person I'm aware of to put some pages from Geste hypergraphique up on the internet. And for a long time, all anybody knew about it was a little excerpt of several pages on Domingos' excellent blog. Anyway, so this is, like I said, it's a more than 80-page graphic novel. It's like the abstract graphic novel that you wish like Victor Moscoso had drawn, but it was already published in France. It was drawn in 1967 and published in 1968 before the first issue of Zap ever even came out. And at the exhibit, one more side note, at the Center for Book Arts, for the very first time anywhere, we are exhibiting some of the original pages from this book, some of the actual planches hypergraphiques. You can see the artwork is just a little bit bigger than the printed book there. So anyway, that I invite you to go. That's the original artwork on the left, and that's the published book on the right there. And I have to say the artwork is beautiful. The originals look like they were drawn yesterday. The other book that came out in 1968 was another Lettrist comic book, not as long, by Maurice Lamette. Again, taking on the identity of El Momo. This is Les Aventures del Momo, The Adventures of El Momo. And he talks about, again, his motivations, because if we look at the bottom, he calls it a bande dessinée. He calls it a comic strip. Okay, he's not differentiating hypergraphics from comics. This is a comic. And he says, I myself tried to show in a comic strip titled Les Aventures del Momo, in which I concentrated, without overdoing it, a certain number of techniques applicable to a narration in signs to show that a hypographer would know how to create not just a simple comic, but a quite innovative comic. And what we see here, it's a comic, but it's specifically a Lettrist comic. He says, if you look at the bottom, it says, bande dessinée supertemporelle, a supertemporal work, that's a Lettrist term, means a work that is not finished, that's never finished until the reader intervenes with it. So it says a supertemporal comic for the reader to color and enrich. Okay, so the comic itself is a kind of abstract account of his sort of peregrinations and ruminations during the events of May 1968. But as you can see, it's drawn in a very minimalist way. It's designed for the intervention of the reader. It leaves a lot of empty space for the reader to finish the work. That's what makes it a Lettrist supertemporal comic. Okay, I want to mention one just kind of as a coda, because I've been going on for an hour now. There are many other things that we could look at. The things that we have looked at, I think, give you kind of a foundation for understanding how kind of the Lettrists, why they even thought about comics at all, why they made things that look like comics, some of which they occasionally distinguished from comics, some of which they, called comics. There's this kind of, sort of dance with the world of comics readership and comics fandom and comics criticism. But the interest in comics is very strong, and it just keeps coming up in these works. I want to mention just kind of one last go around here between Maurice Lamette and the kind of world of organized comics criticism and fandom. In 1967, there was one of several Paris biennial art events in Paris. And one of the events that took place in 1967 as part of that biennial was a kind of conference, or I guess like a kind of panel discussion about the art and expression, the art and literature of graphic expression. And this panel included Maurice Lamette and Isidore Isou, Lettrists, obviously, Gérald Gassiot-Talabeau, who was a curator, Bernard Rancillac, who was a painter at that time, and Claude Moliterni, who was part of that world of organized comics criticism and fandom. And the idea was several historians, artists, authors, and art critics in an exchange about the links between comics, art, and literature, and arguing for its recognition as a major art. There is actually a recording of this discussion in France that I have not had a chance to listen to yet, and that's definitely on my list. But nevertheless, Maurice Lamette gave a, sort of read a text that he had written at this conference, and Claude Moliterni, who by this time was editing a new comics journal, a journal about comics called Phoenix, had apparently told Lamette that he would publish his statement in this comics magazine, Phoenix. Unfortunately, several months went by. The text never appeared in the magazine, and Lumet became impatient, so he published it himself, first in a kind of zine, little magazine-like format that we see on the left, later as a nice little offset printed book called Lettrism, in basically Lettrism in the novel and the plastic arts, in ahead of pop art and comics. That word devant is a little hard to translate. It means sort of like before, and it's a little hard to know if it means confronting pop art and comics, or if he's referring to the fact that they're ahead of pop art and comics. In a way, both are applicable. He certainly would argue that Lettrism was ahead of pop art and comics in many ways, and is now confronting pop art and comics. But in this text, and this is again from what he said at that Paris Biennial in 1967, he writes, "We Lettrists, since 1947, have been the first to love comics as an anticipation of a larger way of communication than ordinary writing, and to defend it against the very moronic artistic and literary critics of the era who considered comics to be an area only good for children and infantile adults." So, some battles have been fought for a very long time, but I mean, again, he's not incorrect. I mean, going back to 1950 in Les Journaux des Dieux, Isou is writing, very interesting things about comics. And in fact, I will say, if you have any French, this book, if you can find it, is a pretty good starter for reading about links between comics and Lettrism, because not only does Lumet say quite a bit in this little book, he also reprints many of the passages relating to comics from Isou's earlier book, Les Journaux des Dieux. So, this was a great, for me, in my research, great starting point. Anyway, so just to kind of conclude here, I guess I would just say, there's more to the intersection of Lettrism and comics than even the things that we've looked at here tonight. There are other things in the exhibit that I haven't talked about here tonight. Although I think, the works that I've talked about are certainly the ones that I've been most interested in and that have captured the most of my attention. I'm still learning about this. The nice thing about doing a project like this is that it creates more opportunities for you to continue learning about the subject. And certainly working with a great co-curator has been part of that too. But nevertheless, I think we already see enough. Like, we see enough to understand that if we're interested in comics, and particularly if we're interested in the possibilities of what comics can be, there's something to see in the work of the Lettrists, both in their thinking about comics and in the comics or comics-like hypergraphics that they made. And it's interesting too, one of the things that is really motivating to me, kind of like what Austin said earlier, one of the things that's useful and interesting about researching these links between comics and historical avant-gardes is that I think it does broaden your palette of understanding of what comics can be and what they can look like, and even what kind of intentions they can serve. That's very different from what you get if you just think about comics as the kind of self-constructed industry and culture of comics, the way it's understood sort of from the inside. And then the other thing that I think is really important about this work is, I think what it does is it gives a kind of ancestry to a lot of contemporary work that I value a lot, that is itself, kind of similarly, pushing against the conventions of the form, or bringing different kinds of influences into comics, or make different kinds of expression. I mean, when you think about comics in a free and open way, some of the most interesting and exciting new works really sometimes more resemble these older avant-garde works than they do the work that we consider as being, foundational to the history of comics, the way we normally think about it. So anyway, this is Comics and Lettrism. That's just one section of the broader exhibit on the Lettrist Book at the Center for Book Arts. I do invite you and encourage you to go check out the exhibit while it's up. It's up through May 2nd. As I said, there's a catalog. We did a first run of 500. They're reprinting it. It is going to be distributed in the US through DAP, and a European distributor picked up 100 copies too, which is great. So yeah, I'm really excited that this show has been came together so nicely. It's been getting very positive responses, very enthusiastic responses. We've done a number of really nice events, and the last thing I'll say is that these dates at the Center for Book Arts are also the dates of a really wonderful show featuring the work of Rosaire Appel, who is here in the audience tonight. We actually included a work by Rosaire in the Best American Comics in 2015 when I was the series editor for that work, and I was really happy to find the work of this book artist, as I kind of understood you to be at the time, who was doing things that were like abstract comics, and we included some of that work. And I'll be on a panel with Rosaire on April 23rd, I think, at the Center for Book Arts. It might be the 24th, Yeah. Well, if I don't know the date, Richard, I mean, I couldn't tell you the day of the week, but it's probably a Thursday. It tends to do those things on Thursdays. Anyway, you can go on their website and figure it out, Anyway, but we're going to talk about the links between the two shows because, I think just it was a really nice, fortuitous circumstance where I think there are some really nice and interesting links between the two exhibits. So I definitely encourage everyone to go to the Center for Book Arts, not just to see the Lettrist show, but also to see Rosaire's show, Chatter as well. Okay, so that's it for my presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions anyone may have.
Get a great round of applause for Bill. No, so I want to open things up now to questions and answers. We have a bunch of questions already in the chat. We have about 40 minutes for Q&A, so hopefully we can get to a lot of people. I'll try to alternate back and forth. I would just like to start off, Bill, by asking you a question that came up to me while you were presenting. I was remembering a Situationist text I read that talked about avant-garde movements post-World War II. And the overall sentiment of the text was, prior to World War II, most avant-garde movements had a political content to them, a political project, and some political utility, usually within the area of some criticism of the contemporary economic order and some project within the avant-garde movement to counter that in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And then post-World War II, according to this text, there's kind of a withering away of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious for you, maybe in general, of the avant-garde movements that connect to comics that you're interested in, what you might view as, I think you touched on it at the end, you view a utility in illuminating people's ideas of what comics are. I'm interested in what you think, maybe in general, what these movements that you're interested in, what their utility might be to you, maybe not how they're historicized, but Lettrism specifically, what you might see as its utility in the world as a kind of, the examples you showed to me, I see them as so clearly having something to do with comics. And I wonder what you think beyond comics, how they might serve.
Yeah, certainly like a lot of people have for many years, I think, turned to the Situationists for some kind of guidance about how to deal with like the current political moment. And in some ways, it does kind of feel like every year the Society of the Spectacle is only more so a Society of the Spectacle, in different and more like accelerated ways. But in terms of Lettrism, like I said, one of the nice things about working on a project like this is you kind of, are able to learn about things. Also, working with a co-curator who knows Lettrism more globally, I can sort of focus on the things that I know better. And there are other areas that my co-curator knows better. And what I can tell you is I know that Isou and Lemaitre wrote quite a bit about politics. I just haven't read a lot of that writing. But what I do know is that one of Isou's big ideas early on was, really right at the beginning of Lettrism, was that he saw youth as specifically constituting a potential revolutionary class. And that, among other ideas, he kind of later felt were reflected in the events of May 1968. I couldn't talk about it beyond that to try and pull out something that's useful other than to say, I think Isou wanted to transform all areas of society. And he wrote about economics, and he wrote about politics, and he wrote about all kinds of things, mathematics even. And I think the thing that to me is just kind of inspiring on a very basic level is just the idea that absolutely everything is open for further development and reinvention. It was a total, I mean, that idea at the beginning of the kind of cyclical, amplic, and chiseling phases. I mean, what's underneath even that is just the idea of constant, everything needs to be constantly renewed. Everything needs all of us working together in creative cooperation to affect constant creative renewal of all aspects of human life. And certainly, I think, and I think some of that too comes from the fact that, this is something that emerges after World War II, when Paris itself was being rebuilt and kind of pulling itself out of the experience of the war, and being invaded and being occupied and rebuilding and reconstituting French society. There's a sense that, like, okay, we're living in the ruins and now we're building everything back up again. And that right now, that doesn't feel so far away either. Like there is a need, maybe before we quite get to the ruins to start, rebuilding certain things or building things back up again. Mm. Yeah, that I think is something I'm not very well versed in. I know there's a book that I have not read that's very specifically about the kind of like somewhat esoteric kind of Talmudic traditions that he was raised in Romania. My understanding, however, is that by the end of his life, I think initially after World War II, like many people of Jewish origins, he was very interested in Israel. However, and I mean he himself, I mean, had a kind of messianic sense about himself. Yeah, but I think by the end of his life, he would not, my understanding is he would not have identified as a Zionist. But that's something my co-curator again knows more about than I do. Mhm.
Bill, I'm going to leave it up to you to maybe call on an initial person from the audience.
Sure.
And then I'll read a question from here. And I
Okay.
just ask you so that people
To read
in
the
the chat
question.
can hear the question.
Sure.
If you can just restate it.
Okay. Does anybody else have a question here in the audience? Yeah, Bob.
Thank you for doing this. I'm curious what you think about the sense of humor of the Lettrists.
Mhm.
I think their work is funny at some level,
Yes.
playful at some level. I understand why the Spirou comic is a reduction of what they're doing, but I also feel like they're objecting to adventure comics. But what about humor comics? It does seem like part of what they're doing, their statements seem so deadpan. I don't know if it's irony or it's pure fury at idiots.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think in general they were, yeah, I mean they were very like insistent on their own terms, basically. I think they were fighting, I think they were waging, let's say, a lot of one-sided wars, and I mean, I think the kind of I mean, what sort of comes across as maybe like an over-the-top style of declamation may well just be what they thought was very much an appropriate part of the avant-garde tradition of, denouncing everything that came before and declaring yourself the avenue towards the paradisiacal, utopian renewal of all society. But at the same time, I mean, this work, for example, is very playful. And Altman, described his own work as a kind of joyful and voluble hypergraphy. So I mean, he was definitely in it more, I think, for the kind of pleasure, whereas Izu could be very whereas we see certainly like Izu, taking a very strong position after that Spirou comic comes out and being very, like, intense in his condemnation and so on. Whereas again, as I said with Lumet, it's a little different. He kind of seems to have this sort of running sort of, attempt at like engaging the comics club and then being rebuffed. So he kind of makes a counterattack and so on, but he doesn't shy away from calling his work comics. He doesn't I mean, he made a hypergraphic comic strip. He makes a bande dessinée super temporelle, So I mean, he's not shying away from it either. Whereas, Izu maybe in his writing would make more of a distinction between comics, which are kind of, in his view, separate text and image without fully merging them, and hypergraphic writing, which fully integrates all modes of signification, if that makes sense.
I'll ask a question from the chat, and Andrea wants to know, she says, I'm curious to know if there are any interactions between the Lettrists and Oulipo.
Okay, yeah, Oulipo, right. That's a good question. I actually can't answer that one off the top of my head. I'm not sure. I mean, I have no doubt that like some of the Oulipo people and some of the Lettrists like Izu and Jean-Louis Bras probably, had some of the same like publishers as some of the Oulipo writers. Like I mean, yeah, that's true. And also too, like Eric Losfeld was a publisher of a lot of these people. There's another publisher I'm blanking on the name of right now. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there are traces there. But I mean, I think I would I wouldn't want to say more than that though. Mm, mm, mm. Yeah.
Do you want to take another question from the audience, Phil?
Anyone else in the audience want to ask a question? Yes, sir. That's okay.
Processing. Anyway, so one thing I was so there's one approach to like from like avant-garde towards comics that like art or like represented with like Crusades or like the previous films, which sees like in at least certain like what we would say is very traditional comics or comics as having like all this potential that's a little bit right. So there's one approach to comics that start to offer from this. Like there's a lot of stuff there, but you only see like what children see, and there's like all this like revolutionary power in various versions of that. So there's something comic. And then there's what seems to be the Lettrist position, which is like comics like suggest something that could be really good, and you're doing the really good stuff,
right?
With those mechanisms, the history of comics kind of like sort of provides us with some equipment that we can then develop into this much more powerful art form. Is there anything that you can kind of in the Lettrist? I've looked for it and I haven't seen some. Just want to go look at where they actually say, well, actually, these comics are pretty good. There is an artistic potential in them that is maybe underappreciated by even Load and Mother fans and something like that, right?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's a good question again. I think it's hard to say, but generally, like going back to oh, sorry. So I guess the general question is like, did the Lettrists like sort of appreciate comics for what they were, or just see it as kind of something having some tools in it that could be used to develop a more sophisticated kind of art? That's a good question. I'm not, I wouldn't want to answer comprehensively, but I do think generally they were very critical of like actually existing comics, kind of going back to some of those early quotes, where he basically talks about, I mean, he still sees, he says certainly, like readers, even the kind of more erudite critics of comics are basically distracted by the dumb adventure stories. And they don't, as he says here, it's as if the form doesn't exist. But again, when he describes it, he makes a distinction. He describes comics, as I said before, as having what he calls a by writing, where it's like the text and the image running on their tracks versus, hypergraphics, which kind of brings them together. I mean, granted, it depends what comics you're looking at, but obviously they're kind of using as their points of comparison something like this, like a typical adventure comic that you would find in an illustré. I think that, and I'm not sure. I mean, and keep in mind, I mean, they're articulating all this stuff in like 1950. I mean, what would have been the good example, the good counterexample at that time? That Go ahead, Richard. Did they read Mad? That's a very good question. Again, I couldn't answer that one. I actually don't know about the history of Mad's publication in France. I do know, yeah, I actually have an issue of Phoenix that has an article about Mad in it. So it's possible, but I can't say for sure. But again, what we see here are these collaged images that are very much from Tarzan style adventure comics. That really seems to be when they talk about comics, that seems very much to be what they're talking about.
It's not hard to bring a comic across. Of course, they never went to America. They
Right.
never discovered it either.
Right.
But people bring things up from here.
Yeah, but I think probably the people who were in the sort of comics milieu and going to the Club de Bande Dessinée and contributing to Phoenix magazine and Gif Whiff are probably the ones who would have been most likely to be aware of those things. And I don't think the Lettrists themselves, despite Lumet's kind of crossing of paths with the Comics Club periodically, I don't think they were so immersed in it. Exactly.
My own hunch was the humor would have been repellent.
Mm-hmm.
To deal with the question he dealt with about how much irony you see, not much.
Mm-hmm.
Ignoring the Situationists.
Yeah.
Louisa has a question in the chat. She asks, do you see any influence of the Lettrists in contemporary French comics?
I mean, contemporary French comics are super interesting, and there's a lot of great and artistic work that's being done. I don't think there's anyone who's like explicitly influenced by the Lettrists, and I think in part because a lot of this stuff still remains very out of print. I mean, the main Lettrist work that's been reprinted a couple times now is, I don't think I have an image of it, but it's Gabriel Pomeran's first hypergraphic book, which is called Saint Ghetto of the Loans. And that has, oh, here it is. I actually do have a couple of images. Here it is. Yes. My caption's in French. But yeah, so this is a book that's been republished in French and in English, although the English edition is smaller, where it's on the left-hand side, it's a poem that continues from page to page. And on the right-hand side of the page, there's always a kind of hypergraphic translation of the text. And that's also something that you can see. Well, I mean, it would take a lot of work to puzzle it out, but it's not arbitrary. It's not arbitrary. And you can see again about 12 pages, 12 of the graphic pages from this book installed at the exhibit at the Center for Book Arts.
You want to take another question? Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Angela. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the questions about the publishing and printing aspects of these work. I mean, when I did a much shorter presentation on this at the Center for Book Arts, and Richard was there, and I remember, we were he kind of commented on how Isou, in terms of being published, started at the top. I mean, his first two books were from Gallimard. I mean, that's I don't know it's like Penguin or whatever. I mean, it's just high level, prestige literary publishing. But for the most part, a lot of their books were self-published. I mean, this book is basically self-published by Isou. They did, most of these magazines are self-published by the Lettrists. I think like this, Maurice Lemaitre was very good at like economizing, so like this magazine, he basically printed the logo like it was a letterhead. So it's blank, and then like on top of that, he prints like one color in black. So it's got different writing and artwork on the cover of every issue of the magazine. It's two color, but what he did was he got like letterhead paper and and it's just printing it black and white on that. The review O is published by Roberto Altman and Jacques Spacagna. So or I guess yeah, I think technically Altman is the publisher. So yeah, I mean we're mostly talking about self-published or very, very small editions. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, so you're asking, about beyond the comics, more of like the book objects. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely a big part of the show and one of the reasons really for doing it at the Center for Book Arts is, while I'm focusing today on the comics and we do have a focus area on Lettrist comics at the exhibit is more broadly about the Lettrist book. And as you said, there are many small editioned like artists' books and many one-of-a-kind books with kind of weird bindings and different interesting material qualities. And yeah, I mean, Izu, I mean, this discussion of hypergraphics, it's kind of within a broader discussion of of the evolution of the book. Izu would talked about what he called the three-dimensional novel. There's a quote where he says, "The novel must have a smell or it will die." He talked about the idea of a novel being something that you read by going through a neighborhood and going from bar to bar and getting the information, from each place and piecing together the narrative that way. He said, one day the novel will be, like a national holiday. He said publishers will also need to get involved with animal husbandry. I mean, he said the novel needed to bring all, I mean, again, you can talk about inaugurating a new amplic phase, bringing life into itself.
That's,
Mhm.
you can't do it.
Yeah, but he can articulate it.
It's not allowed. You can't tell.
Yeah.
Kevin asks in the chat, do we know how Debord felt about this work, given he used comics in a very different way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because I don't know if I have any images of, oh, I do have images of situationist material. So yeah, so the Lettrists, I'm sorry, the Situationists were very well known for um, uh, what they called détournement, this theory of détournement, the idea that you could, take a pre-existing media object and change its meaning, subvert its meaning. And so and they did it with film, but one of the most visible types of détournant that the Situationists produced were Situationist comics, or at least they take a panel and change the caption, or they'd take a comic strip like this one here. So it's called Tarzan Flic de la Jungle, meaning Tarzan cop of the jungle cop. So they're calling Tarzan a cop, and we all know about all cops. But anyway, yeah, and what's interesting is I don't know. Yeah, here it is. This is from one of the essays by Debord and Gilget Volman, and both of them had been Lettrists. And this is written in 1956. In the essay where they explain détournement, what it is and how it works, they refer to metagraphics and they refer to détournement, like the Situationist comics, as metagraphic. So they say metagraphic writing, no matter how outdated its plastic framework may be, obviously they're dissing it. They're saying, oh, it's outdated, but this is what we're going to use. And metagraphic writing, no matter how outdated its plastic framework may be, presents far richer opportunities for détourning prose as well as other appropriate objects or images. And they talk about how you can do this with cinema, and then eventually they say, and of course, comics is a great form for détournement because you can separate the text in the image. You can replace the image, you can replace the text, and keep the same images. And I will add, Debord started out, as I said, as a lettrist. He was a member of the lettrist movement. And one of his first works, his major work as a lettrist was a film. Oh yeah, called Hurlement en faveur de Sade. And this is a picture of Debord with the text of his screenplay from the Lettrist journal Ion. And one of the ideas about film that Izu describes at the beginning of his work in film, which was very early, is what he calls discrepant cinema, meaning there's no relation between the soundtrack and the image. So it's kind of like if you combine that idea of discrepant cinema separating the text and image in film with metagraphics, I mean, you can see how those are both very strong influences on the Situationist comics, on Situationist détournement. It's a kind of discrepant metagraphics, you might say, if that makes some sense.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, that person's had their hand up for a while.
Sorry, I think I misunderstood, but again, you mentioned something about how contemporary comics are much more influenced than what society might consider important comics. So I was just wondering if you could expand on that. Very quick.
Well, I think what I meant to say. Oh, sorry. So the question is, yeah, like, there are contemporary comics that are more inspired by Lettrism than the types of comics that are often more visible in the culture. Yeah, and to an extent, I think I wouldn't say they're inspired by Lettrism, but you can sort of see a kind of family resemblance, I mean, just in the sense that, I mean, for example, the kind of simple, obvious answer, would be like, you could look at like the work of the Franco-Belgian publisher Fremok, for example, and you could find a kind of mix of abstraction and figuration, people who are making comics, that are inspired perhaps in some cases by fine arts backgrounds or so on, or even the work of Austin English here, that kind of both is informed by but moves in different directions from the kind of standard traditional comics, the narrative comics, figurative comics that form the kind of classic tradition of comics publishing. And the what I would say is, not that necessarily any of those artists are influenced by the Lettrists, but in a way, I mean, you can almost like, I mean, people have talked about like how artists create their own ancestors or identify their own ancestors, and in a way, I mean, you can sort of see how, if you wanted to find a historical precedent for what I think are some of the most exciting comics being made today, you might look at the Lettrists and other examples of work like this from throughout the history of culture, that are things that are like comics, but very far off the beaten path, being made by people who don't feel beholden to the kind of standard modes of expression that we normally see in comics.
We'll end things with one more question from chat. I think this is a really interesting one to end on. Daniel asks, in Altman's hypergraphy, different systems, language, music, mathematics, and image appear side by side. Do you think there is an intention to create semantic interaction between these systems, or are they simply juxtaposed in general?
It's a good question, and I think in a way, I mean, it's kind of going back to like Les Journaux des Dieux. I mean, you can sort of ask the question of like, to some extent, like, to what extent is this, this kind of relates to Richard's question about Gabriel Pomeran's book, are those rebuses legible? Are those hypergraphic translations of the poetry legible? And I think, in a way, I think there's always, maybe not always, but often, let's say, a bit of a kind of conceptual element to all of it. The idea that in a way it's a sort of anticipation of a future form of reading, maybe that hasn't even been fully mastered yet, but in a way, by just kind of like pushing the forms further and further, you kind of almost like stimulate this kind of evolution. And in Altman's work, I think there's there's a lot of collage elements, really, when you look at the original artwork, and this isn't a good example, but nevertheless, the pages really look quite clean and fresh, and one of the few indications that you're looking at originals quite often is that you can see that like where there's a collaged element, like the date 1967 on the last panel here, the collaged paper is a little brown, so yeah. So there's like a lot of collage on elements there, so I think a lot of it is more, I mean, I think it's the kind of the thrill of the juxtaposition. I mean, I think too, though, it really is I think it's almost like it creates such a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of like prolific, polyvalent sort of expression that it does all kind of merge together. You know, like you sort of stop noticing like what's typographic and what's hand drawn and whatever, because there's just so much stuff in there. So I think it's sort of, you know, and the fact that in a way, you know, and this is something that I think comics actually do for Lettrism, is they provide a kind of legible structure within which all of this, you know, sometimes perhaps challenging to parse, like polyvalent stuff can flow. You know, I mean, because when you read, you know, this, I mean, I've read this Altman book more than once, you know, but it's like, you know, it's like, I mean, it's like watching, yeah, I mean, it's a bit sometimes reading this stuff, it's like watching like abstract cinema or something like that, you know, which is beautiful, you know, but also it's like it's not something that you like watch in quite the same way. You know, it's something that you sort of interact with, you know, and sometimes you become more passive and sometimes you become more active, you know, and sometimes it triggers thoughts and you know, your brain goes someplace else for a few minutes and then you come back, you know, and I mean, I think, you know, this is different because it's static and it's visual. But I think, you know, what comics do is they kind of give a legible structure to work that otherwise is quite happy to experiment intensely with the limits of legibility, let's say.
Saying about your lecture, I hope the people in the chat hear me, because he wants you to go, he wants to persuade you to go back to see the exhibition. Thank you, Bill.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Well, thank you, Richard. That, you know, Richard says my lecture makes people is persuasive and makes people want to go back and see the exhibition. I appreciate that very much.
That's true. And let's give Bill another round of applause for this beautifully researched and really engaging talk. And I should just say personally, Bill's thinking and writing and curation of comics has always been very influential to me. So I'm honored that he agreed to do this session.
Oh, thanks.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you to all of you in the audience for your questions, and for fans and followers of the symposium. Our next week, we will have David Francis Taylor speaking on the golden age of caricature. So the way that you found out about this session of the symposium, you can find out about that in the same way. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
And thank you again.
And Austin, the feeling's mutual. Thank you, my friend.
Even just